The free speech question here is such an interesting one in my view because for years this country has been having a breakdown over free speech. There has been endless debates about, free speech being denied in comedy routines and free speech being denied in university debating clubs. And you have a situation where, columnists who are published in major national newspapers every single week of their lives are allowed to tour around the place saying that their speech is being curtailed or denied and they don't have free expression. And yet, at the same time, we have members of a political party being denied the right to talk on substantive issues, being denied the right to even debate questions like Jeremy Corbyn's whip being suspended, something which is such a fundamental question to the Labour Party, such a fundamental question to all of what's happened in the last few years and what's happening in the party now, and they're not being allowed to discuss or debate that. And we hear then nothing. It's crickets from the mainstream media on that question, on people, members of political parties being denied their right to speak. That obviously doesn't come under the free speech debate. And when it comes to the likes of The Guardian and The New Statesman, it's easy to understand why. They've spent the last 5 years telling us all they have to hold the opposition to account just as much as the government because, of course, they didn't like the Corbyn leadership and they were opposed to the idea of socialist policies. Now they've turned around to being totally sycophantic to the Starmer leadership, to the new Labour Party regime and all the rest of it. We can't really expect much by way of defence from them. But you might have even expected that the right-wing press would go in on this because, of course, it's a good way of attacking the Labour Party and whatever else, and it's a controversy. But we don't even get these defences of free speech coming out now in the right-wing press. And the reason for that, I think, is really interesting. They quite like what's happening with the Labour Party now. They quite like the idea that what we're having is a return to the idea of two establishment parties with pro-corporate policies who make their decisions within a tiny space in Westminster, and that we're going to go back to a period before we had the potential that there might actually be a government that would make really fundamental change in this country, that would really fight to redistribute wealth and power from the rich and big corporations to ordinary people, that would fight for a fundamentally different kind of democracy. They see, and they are right, that what's happening in the party now is that all of those ideas are being driven out with these huge numbers of people who are leaving, and with the suspensions and with the crackdowns that is happening in the Labour Party now. And what is happening is a return to basically the idea that we have two governing parties in Britain who can be separated by relatively small differences of opinions, where their fundamental orientation, the Labour Party will go back to being a party with big money donors and millionaires behind them. They'll go back to being a party that doesn't challenge the status quo economically, and that no matter who loses, the likes of the millionaires and billionaires who run the right-wing press will always win, because they will be able to say that there is a loyal opposition in Keir Starmer and Starmer's leadership team. And by loyal opposition, they know what they will mean. An opposition that's going to be loyal to the state, to the way things are done in politics, to the economic model that we have, and to a continuation of a system where a tiny number of people profit at the expense of the work of the vast majority. And that's why, they're never going to come out and defend us either, because they're quite happy with that way of doing politics, and they're quite happy that that's what's returning to the party. I think the real danger in what we're seeing now is this turning of the left's language back on itself, and it comes from the real problems of understanding that informed so much of what the left has said and done in recent years, where people believed that the speech question could be divorced from the question of power. That we could set up all of these kind of rubrics of what you're allowed to say in public, and that we could, in a number of instances, for example, hand them over to major social media corporations, and that wouldn't then be turned back on the left at some future point. The truth of it is, free speech is always a question of your ability to project and convey your speech, and who decides what is legitimate speech and what isn't. And in none of those arenas are the left in control. So what we're seeing in the Labour Party now is these arguments about, we can't hold the debates on questions of the removal of Corbyn's whip, because we need to create safe space for members. This is a conscious, I think, adopting of the rhetoric and the language of the campus left of recent years by establishment figures, much as social media corporations have done the same thing when they've been, for instance, banning the accounts of a whole ranges of different people who are saying things that are considered to be problematic or unacceptable and whatever else. When you work in the media, you get an interesting understanding of that question of what speech and power means. Because, of course, there is this idea that the media and the press is really about investigating injustices, these intrepid reporters who are out there fighting to discover the truth about society. When you're in it, you see much more what it is, which is in countries like Britain, where a majority of all the papers people read every day are owned by two corporations, the Daily Mail Group and News UK. It's a means for people to project, extremely wealthy people, moguls, to project their ideas across society using these media outlets. And that's much more the reality of what the media is about. And when you think of what that means in terms of speech, it means that people's right to say certain things, their right to get platforms, is all conditional on how much they appeal to the politics of the people who own the media outlets and are able to therefore project those opinions across society. So there's always been this relationship between speech and power, and our right to say things, and our right sometimes, let's be frank as well, people's right to say things and be wrong and then be educated and be brought around. And we can't say that those ideas are never there. People don't say racist things, of course they do. They don't say anti-Semitic things, of course they do. But people's right to be able to make those mistakes and be educated and be reformed and change is all conditional on this question of power. And when you have a situation where speech is shut down in the very first instance, that you can't even allow a conversation to happen because there's this risk that someone might potentially say something that's difficult, I tell you what you end up with. You end up with a political arena where the only people who are able to speak and able to say anything are those who are trained academically through going to university politics courses. They're trained as consultants. They say always the right thing, and they know that the exact words and phraseology that they're allowed to use. And everyone else, which by the way is the vast majority of working class people, are cut out. They're cut out of the political arena altogether because they don't have that kind of rubric. They don't have the terms that you are and aren't allowed to use nailed down. And that is really a situation the left should never have allowed to emerge. But so much, unfortunately, of our misunderstanding of the nature of language, speech and power has allowed the right to now co-opt it from us. I think the right's understanding of free speech in the first instance comes down to your right to be able to offend people. And it is born out of a feeling that they should be able to say what they want without consequence. That comes about inevitably anyway for the vast majority of wealthy and powerful people. Whereas the truth of what matters in terms of free speech, and I think it applies across society, across political spectrum, whatever else, free speech matters when you're able to speak truth to power. It is a question that fundamentally is about being able to say uncomfortable things. And this country has a huge range of very legitimate free speech questions that if the right were really interested in them, they would be banging on the door about. For instance, defamation law in Britain makes it extremely difficult for journalists and small publications to hold to account very wealthy people, because they can take out ridiculous lawsuits against you all the time, tie you up, and in the vast majority of circumstances get their way simply by bleeding you financially and by preventing you from being able to fight a case like that, because the vast majority don't have the resources and money to do it. That's a major issue of free speech. Your right to be able to hold powerful people to account, your right to be able to say what you will about in terms of investigative reporting and whatever else about the crimes committed by major corporations. All of that is impacted by the defamation laws, which in England, the English defamation laws, are extremely restrictive. And if they were interested in free speech, That would be the first thing that they would go for. And if they were genuinely interested in questions of free speech, they would be fighting very hard against corporations who try to crack down on what their employees say in the public setting. So you've got a situation where in loads of instances, major corporations are now trying to control the social media outputs of their workers because, you know, they don't want any scandals to blow up in some instances maybe, but actually more generally what they don't want is workers going out there and saying, I work for X corporation and they pay me terrible money, you know, I'm in ridiculous conditions. They don't want workers, for instance, in Amazon in the West Midlands to be going out and saying, I work for the wealthiest corporation in the world and I have to piss in a bottle because they won't give us toilet breaks. They don't want that story out there. And that's a pretty good case, you would imagine, for a free speech crusader to be taking up, but they never do. And the sad thing about this, in my view, is that we gave them the space too much. We allowed this question of the people's right to say things and to speak to be determined on the right wing's terrain. And the left did that over recent years, and it did it because of its lack of understanding of the relationship between power and speech. And what we've now ended up with is a whole load of charlatans who don't care about real free speech issues, which again, as I say, real free speech issues are ones about your ability when it is uncomfortable to those in power to say things to them. Not when, you know, the speech that's really never threatened to any great degree in this society are ones that suit the interests and the already established power structures. You can always say and do what you want from those positions, because even if you get a bit of criticism online, it's not going to impact you enormously. The ones where you could actually lose your job, lose your livelihood, or for instance in cases of defamation where you can like be dragged through the courts over it, those are questions of speaking truths that are uncomfortable to people who've got a lot of money, and that's where the core of free speech lies. When we talk about you know, cancel culture and some of these controversies, one of the ones that most recently came up, I think, is a very useful and instructive episode, which was Lawrence Fox and the rest of them raising the Pogues and Fairy Tale of New York, where they were talking about, you know, the great infringement upon the right to free speech of changing line in that song and removing a kind of homophobic slur from it. And obviously it produced this kind of outrage. But it's really important to remember the history of the Pogues and the songs that they produced. The Pogues produced a song about the Birmingham Six, which was, you know, a song that told the truth about that case before the truth came out. It was a song that talked about the Birmingham Six and the Guildford Four having been taken in, forced to give false confessions, beaten up, tortured, all things that we now, by the way, know to be true, and fitted up for crimes they never committed. And that song was banned on the radio in this country under anti-terror laws. It was not played. The Pogues were a hugely popular band, and they were written out of British popular culture for a period around producing that song, because it was seen to be too threatening, too challenging to the dominant order here. And at that time, we didn't hear a damn word from right-wing free speech champions. There was no mass campaign being run by the Telegraph and any of these people to defend the rights of the Pogues, to say what was actually true about people who are locked up unjustly in this country for crimes that they never committed. We only hear it when they want to go around the place defending their right to say homophobic slurs. And it sums up the right's idea of what free speech is about. And it is totally at odds with the real threats to free speech, which come down the line whenever power gets concentrated and people feel they have a right to determine and to impose real consequences on what people say in order to serve power. And usually that is when you've got situations like people, you know, you've got anti-terror campaigns, and do people have a right to resist these? When you've got situations of wars, when you've got workers who are on very little money and who really can't afford to take the risk to say what the truth is. These are the cases where the right and your ability to speak freely really comes under threat. And those of us, you know, who are engaged in these situations, you know it. You feel it in your gut. You know, your ability to speak when you genuinely feel scared at the prospect not just of a Twitter thread or a pylon or something like this, but when you genuinely feel scared that you might lose your house for saying it, that you might have a policeman knocking at your door for saying it, that you might get taken in and put through the ringer. You might have your career destroyed. You might lose your wages, your jobs, your ability to support your family. People know, right, in your gut, you know the kind of issues and cases where that is the risk, and that's where the threat to free speech really lies. And it does impact and has historically impacted the left so much more. You think of people in the United States going back 100 years and the battles over free speech that people like Eugene Debs waged. The presidential candidate, the socialist in the United States, who won 1 million votes for the presidency from a prison cell. And why was he in prison? He was in prison because he gave a seditious speech, a speech that was against the First World War. A fantastic speech which people should go and look up, the Canton speech. And you know, these were campaigns that the left had to fight and has had to fight for 100 years against powerful interests deciding that saying something against the establishment was too potentially risky. And you know, the threats to your speech and your right to speak usually come almost exactly in correlation to your threat to the establishment. If you are able to lay out a position like Eugene Debs did, which might potentially undermine millions of people's support for a ridiculous imperial slaughter in the First World War and their willingness to go and fight in that war, well then that is too dangerous for them to allow to continue. And the contemporary examples of, you know, workers who work for major corporations, which is, I think, one of the great free speech issues of the day, who are denied their right to go and say in public what their working conditions really are. Because it's too much of a threat, this idea that you're going to have thousands of people who work for Amazon being a good example, but it's not the only one. Thousands of people who work for McDonald's, thousands of people who work for, you know, corporate machines are going to be able to turn around and tell the public who consume their products the truth of how those products are put together, the truth of the working conditions and how miserable they are and how difficult their lives are forced to be. Those are cases where, you know, free speech is a fundamental to the pursuit of truth in society, and it is denied by the established order. I think the question of victimhood in this debate is a very interesting one because it raises the discussion over who is inflicting injustice in this society and who is receiving it. And you can clearly see in the case of right-wing talking heads, when they raise the spectre of free speech, that they cast themselves in the role of a victim, because to them it is so outrageous, the idea that they would ever be challenged for any of their views, because they've lived lives of impunity, coming from wealthy backgrounds and then becoming stenographers of the corporate elite and the establishment. The idea that anyone would have the temerity to challenge them and their right to say things becomes, in their mind, something that casts them as a victim. Whereas the truth of it is, this society is such an incredibly unequal one, where we have queues of thousands of people at food banks who need to go and just to sustain themselves, just to feed their families and their kids, they need to rely upon charitable donations. And they, in many cases, are working poor. Like very, very large numbers of people in this country, the majority of those who are relying upon things like food banks, are people who are working every day of their lives in ridiculous, underpaid, poorly paid conditions, with insecure hours, with, you know, at the beck and call of their bosses, of in many cases big corporate elites, people who are working in retail, people who work in hospitality. It often is major corporations who are underpaying them. And These are people who are, have a right to have their indignation voiced. These are people who, if you're going to talk about who are victims of the system that we live under, these are people who have a right to claim that mantle, and yet they almost never do. Because the truth of it is, there's more pride in working class communities in this country in the lives that they lead than to go around bleating and casting themselves constantly as the victims. That is a pride that does not exist in the, privileged elites of Westminster politics and the scions of the aristocracy of British society, who find themselves in positions of aimless complaint about the injustices that they face. And this, I think, is true on an international level as well. I think it is true when people say, when there are these kind of regular controversies over questions of things like the British Empire or of what Britain and its military might has done abroad, and there is a constant drumbeat narrative from the right-wing press that what is happening is our soldiers are being victimized and whatever else, whereas the actual victimization that is happening is oftentimes the neglect of those same soldiers who are sent out into these circumstances and are then not given the support they need when they get back, are cast back onto the scrap heap. Very often came from very poor and working class backgrounds, who are then sent right back to those backgrounds with the injuries, physical injuries that they've received, and with the mental health difficulties that often come with serving as a soldier. And the real victims beyond all of that, God forbid we ever talk about what happens beyond the shores of this country, are the people who are at the other end of the gun. People who have been, invaded, have had their cities and homes destroyed, have had to deal with the consequences of their entire countries being torn up and turned into chaos. The people of Iraq, who had to deal with not only the destruction of their civil society, but the sectarian conflict which followed, which was part of what was stoked by the Western powers and their interests, which have had to deal with the rise of ISIS, and this kind of extreme reactionary right-wing ideology, which took over so much of that country and committed terrible crimes against the Yazidis and so on. And these people never appear when the victim narrative is raised. So we don't have a conversation in this country that refers to the Iraq war, that gives voice to Iraqis. There are plenty of Iraqis, because of that conflict, living in Britain, people who've had to flee their homeland. There are plenty of Iraqis who are living here because of the weapons that Britain sold and Saddam Hussein beforehand when he was our friend. But these people are never the ones who are given the space in our mainstream media to make their case. They're never the ones who are given the mantle of victimhood. The controversies that are drummed up by the right-wing media are ones about your right to say certain things about what the wars that the powerful wage. They're the ones the right-wing media are concerned about, and always will be. And until we break the power of that media, millionaire and billionaire owned media, serving millionaire and billionaire interests, we will never get a conversation that reflects the reality of who imposes injustice in this society and who receives it. When we talk about why debate is so important in politics, and where the left has got some of these questions around speech and power wrong, debate really occurs, like the really important debates that change our society occur when people start to challenge the dominant ideas that they have been educated into from the time that they're kids, in many instances through the education system, that they have received from the mainstream media, which shape the kind of common sense that runs society. When somebody begins to say, actually, no, I fundamentally disagree with this aspect of what is just considered common sense, which is considered to be a hegemonic idea, that's when real debates of importance and significance that change people's worldviews take place. It is, I think, a misunderstanding of the nature of power and speech, to feel that the concept of debate over certain issues is threatening at the fundamental level, or can be compared to violence and so on. Because the truth of it is, when we want to talk about the far right, and I think it's well worth talking about that. What is so dangerous about far right and fascist politics? What empowers it? What created a situation where fascism could take over countries like Spain and Germany and Italy at the earlier part of the 20th century? The reason why it was able to do that was because fascism was serving the interests of the ruling elite in those countries, who were being challenged by popular grassroots working class movements who wanted to change the way those societies worked. That is the reason. Why did fascism rise up in Spain? Because the Spanish people voted for a Republican government that wanted to redistribute wealth and power. Why did we end up with fascism in Italy? Because Italy developed one of the stronger socialist movements of the late 19th, early part of the 20th century. Germany, which we should remember was the heartbeat of the socialist movement, had mass trade union organizations, mass socialist and communist political parties that were threatening the established order in that country. The reason why fascism came to power, Nazism came to power in Germany, was because the ruling elites circled around that as their means of smashing through this threat to their power and to their wealth. And so the reason why fascist ideas are so dangerous is not that they're thrown out and debated, is that fascists organize around them in the interest of the ruling layers of society, in the interest of that these fascist ideas are really dangerous because they become useful to the ruling class at a certain moment in history where they need to crush democratic movements. And that's what makes those ideas so potentially damaging to society. And it isn't the concept of debate, it's the concept actually of shutting down debate. Because what happens is, when at a certain moment the debate is thrown open fundamentally, not just should we change society by this number of degrees that way, or this number of degrees that way, should we have one pro-corporate party running the show who's a bit more socially liberal, or one pro-corporate party running the show who's a bit more socially conservative, but should we change the entire social order? It was at those moments of history that fascism rose, when those fundamental debates were happening over the nature of society, and it was precisely to shut those debates down that fascism was weaponized by the ruling class, to smash the trade unions, to smash the socialist parties, to stop the elections from taking place, to close the newspapers, and to stop a deep, profound social debate that might challenge the wealth and power of the elite. The sad thing about all of this, when we talk about the anti-Semitism debate, is that the current Israeli government aligns itself with some of the most virulent anti-Semites in the world. Proper, hardline, right-wing figures, people who, like the leadership of the Hungarian government and Viktor Orban, whose entire mission is to perpetuate a message of anti-Semitic politics, which can, develop not only in Hungary but across Eastern Europe, and actually other allies they have amongst the far right of Eastern Europe, who were the very same people who celebrate pogroms against Jews historically, which those hardline nationalist movements committed, and their alliances in many instances with the Nazis. So it is genuinely a really sad state of affairs that people are allowing a conversation about anti-Semitism to be shaped around the state of Israel. And I think that more fundamentally, those of us in the Labour Party, when we talk about Israel, rather than allowing that conversation to be shaped around anti-Semitism, which is a much broader and different conversation, and particularly in societies like Britain, has a deeper resonance in terms of like where anti-Semitic politics sprang from in this country and where they were held up for so many years amongst the deeply anti-Semitic aristocracy, who were very supportive of figures like Oswald Mosley, by contrast, of course, to the left, who was out on the streets fighting against those figures, and Irish working class dockers who were out in Cable Street at that time fighting alongside the Jewish people there, because they remembered when they were out on strike that the Jewish neighbours that they had supported their kids through those times. This is a much more complex discussion about the history of anti-Semitism in this country. But when we talk about Israel, and we separate that issue out, I think one thing can be said very, very clearly in relation to the current Labour Party debate, which is the Labour Party today spends far more time discussing and debating how it's appropriate to describe Israel's occupation of the Palestinians than talking about how to bring that occupation to an end. And that question cannot be legitimate. That position cannot be legitimate for a progressive political party in the 21st century when we're talking about the level of deprivation the Palestinians face, when the level of oppression that those people face, that we have this not only decades-long occupation and dispossession and humiliation of the Palestinians, which has been ongoing and which is one of the world's great and most deepest injustices, but when it's getting worse, when the current Israeli government are making clear day by day that they have no intention of respecting any prospect of a two-state solution, where they continue to have more and more and more settlers in the West Bank, where they talk about the prospect of having Jerusalem as the undivided capital, which basically wipes out any Palestinian sovereignty, which was agreed on the 67 terms to East Jerusalem, when they pass laws in the Israeli parliament which are designed quite distinctly to allow for an apartheid system to emerge. And let me tell you, I spent time in Palestine. I spent time in the West Bank and I got to see it. And I understand why the ANC and the liberation movement in South Africa, the Black liberation movement in South Africa, the people who are the best experts in the world at telling us what apartheid is, say that it is apartheid. Because I went and I saw in Kalkilia the wall that was surrounding that town. I went and saw how those people had to live. I saw, people who are elderly Palestinians having to go in and out every day through checkpoints, controlled by 18-year-old soldiers with guns, and the humiliation of what all of that meant. I saw in the West Bank roads that were different for different communities. I saw the roads where the Palestinians were allowed to drive versus the road where the Israelis are allowed to drive. I went to Hebron and I saw streets where Palestinian houses are covered in cages and they're not allowed to walk on their own streets, whereas the Jewish population in that city is allowed to walk on those streets. And the question emerges, why? What is the reason behind all of this? And what can you describe that as other than apartheid? And also when we're talking about this issue, it's important to say that the Israeli government now basically admits that its aim is to have a single Israeli-controlled territory that runs right the way across Israel, Palestine, and that entire area, that runs from the river to the sea. And their ambitions in that regard can only be realized by keeping a permanently subjugated Palestinian population in place without the rights of access to equal democratic rights, equal economic rights, and all the rest of it. Because you could not have a stable Israeli state as a Jewish state, which is what the project obviously is, in that entire territory, while giving all of the Palestinians in the West Bank an equal right to a vote in it. Because that would mean you would create a binational state, and it would be the very, antithesis of what Benjamin Netanyahu wants to see. So what we end up with is a policy that in all of the underground realities is moving towards, further and further towards being a clear and established apartheid state. And yet we have a conversation in the Labour Party which couldn't be more in contrast with the conversations in the 70s and the 80s about supporting Black South Africans fighting apartheid in their country. Knowing that so many fundamental arguments about how the world works is against the establishment today is one of the reasons why they're so determined to try to close down avenues of alternatives to their policies and their politics, because they can no longer create convincing moral justifications for a world where wealth concentrates more and more every year into smaller numbers of hands, where corporations, not as we were told the great myths about this system in the past, where there would be everyone would become their own little capitalist and all the rest of it. Actually, the truth of it is these major corporate giants control more and more aspects of our lives with every passing year, while wages stagnated for the longest period since Victorian times. Working people can't get ahead no matter what they do. An entire generation is growing up on low pay, 0-hour contracts, unable to afford their rent, burdened with debt. What is the moral justification for this system? There isn't one. How can they make it? How can they go out there in public and argue and beat us in an argument over the continuity of this system and the way it goes? They can't. And so what they have to do is they have to find ways to tilt the pitch. And their ways to tilt the pitch in many cases are using the mainstream media as a propaganda vehicle for millionaires and billionaires and trying to bring up endless nonsense controversies to distract us from the fundamental inequalities in our society. That's one way. Another way is simply by shutting down alternatives. And whether that means they're going to kick people off the social media platforms, or whether that means they're going to change their algorithms, which a lot of them are doing to try to exclude really fundamentally challenging ideas from coming forward. This is obviously their ambition, and it is born out of the fact that, you know, when I was growing up, the term capitalism was synonymous with freedom and dynamism and opportunity and all these words that people came to associate it with. Today, if you say the word capitalism to people, it's inequality, it's poverty, it's, you know, corporate giants who are screwing their workers, it's the bankers' bonuses after the crash. That's what this system is now synonymous with, and they can't win that argument anymore, and so they have to find ways of shutting it down. I think we're in the middle now of one of the biggest attacks on political debate and democracy that we have seen in recent years, certainly inside the Labour Party for a long time. We're seeing huge numbers of people being suspended from their crime being holding discussions and debates over the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn's whip. These are people who are elected representatives locally, CLP chairs, CLP secretaries, and you have the party leadership, of course, as well now, indicating that they're prepared to suspend not only those but thousands of members, which is a quote from the other day, if it was necessary in order to shut down this conversation. And it's worth, you know, getting your head around how this all happened and the process behind it. These come from diktats in the General Secretary's office, of course, entirely backed and supported by the leadership. But those diktats started off saying the reason we couldn't talk about this was that it was an open disciplinary case. The open disciplinary case, of course, got shut because it got resolved by the Labour Party National Executive, and they botched that line, and so they had to come up with a new line. And the new line is, well, the reason we can't hold these debates is not because any of the motions are anti-Semitic, not because any of them say anything anti-Semitic, but because they open the door that someone in a meeting might say something anti-Semitic. A standard which, if it was applied, you know, would open the potential to shutting down debate on any number of issues. The idea that you can say, if somebody in a meeting might say something racist, we can preemptively shut down the right to have that conversation is so, you know, eminently absurd that no one who is interested in political speech, democracy, discussion, debate could believe in it. Of course, this is also not a standard that the party now applies to its MPs. They're perfectly entitled to go around and speak on this issue as much as they want. They can go from newsroom to newsroom to newsroom, which is just as well, because it's not like a Labour MP has ever said anything racist. So we can have different standards between our members who have to be kept in a position where they're denied their right to speak, their right to express themselves, their right to put across opinions. But our MPs are given those rights. Our party bureaucrats are given those rights. And that is just an indication of the level of contempt for grassroots politics which exists in the Labour Party, for the members who actually go out and do the work of building the Labour Party across the country. And it is a flavour of what the new leadership of the Labour Party wants to do. And it is their vision for politics, and it's been there since really the start of Starmer's leadership. And his vision for politics, in my view, is that the Labour Party is going to be reduced to a narrow Westminster vehicle. Something where you're going to have a small number of professional consultants and focus groups deciding on what happens in the party, on its messaging and what it's about, that we're going to go back from all of the useful and progressive ideas that came in recent years, which was that politics in this country has to be broadened out. It has to be something that is taking place in communities. It has to be more democratic. It has to set a higher bar for the kind of change we want. And instead, we're going to go back to the idea of a small number of people in suits making the political decisions in Westminster, in a couple of square miles within the capital city, and that, is really what is behind this effort. And there's nothing that makes that clearer than the fact that this attempt to suspend people is happening at the same time as a hollowing out of the party across the board. We know that 57,000 members have left just since Keir Starmer was elected as a Labour leader, but actually far, far more are in arrears and have effectively left than even that number. We're probably talking about 100,000 people. So for years in this country, we have heard about the need to get more people involved in politics. The fact that the establishment wants greater participation, greater turnout, greater engagement. And yet we have a celebration of the hollowing out on a mass scale, talking about probably six-figure numbers of people who are departing the political arena. And that, to me, is the great hypocrisy that lies behind all of those conversations and all of what's happening in the Labour Party today. I think the question of Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party is a really interesting one now, because the leadership, Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, are conducting themselves as if Corbyn can simply be treated as a pariah, as if they were not part of a Corbyn project for years in terms of serving in shadow cabinet positions. And they expect the people of this country, and Labour members in particular, to just accept a situation where this person, who was such an important part of the Labour Party as its leader for the past 5 years, can simply be expelled or cast off to the wilderness and have his whip removed and be allowed to sit out as an independent, rather than somebody who's a member of the Labour Party and Labour MP, which he has been for decades. And it raises the question, doesn't it, for Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner: were you lying 12 months ago when you were telling the country that this guy should be the Prime Minister, or are you lying now when he's not even good enough to be a Labour MP? And the answer to that, I think we have to come to the conclusion that they were lying a year ago because they wanted their own career paths, because they were climbing the ladder, because they were climbing a greasy pole. They wanted to get themselves in positions that were of prominence on a national level politically, and so they pretended as if they supported the socialist policies, the more radical aspects of the Corbyn project, of threatening the established order in this country, of redistributing power and wealth from the corporate elite to the mass of working people. They were pretending throughout all of that. And now we're seeing, when they're in a position of greater power, what their real opinion is. And that, to me, is the kind of insincerity which was everything that was wrong with politics in the years leading up to 2015. It was everything that people hated, which produced so many ructions in the political landscape, so many rebellions against the established order from the left, from the right, over years in the period after the financial crisis. A politics which is based on a small number of people who are well trained to never say what they actually believe. A small number of suits who get their views from focus groups, who align their policies with big corporations, whose support base is their wealthy donors, and who create a politics of insincerity where no one believes a damn thing that they say. They don't believe in a cause. They don't believe in social change. They don't believe in anything fundamental. What they do is simply try to tell you at every point what they think you want to hear. And I don't believe, actually, my view, that they're going to be able to go back to doing politics that way. This is their project. This is their mission. But the world is too messed up. Things are too unequal. People are too unhappy with our political and democratic system to allow that politics to just return. And my bet is, and for Labour members who are, feeling disillusioned and whatever, I think it is worth bearing in mind that there's only so long you can tell lies to people and be this insincere and not be seen through. The ongoing attempt to defame Labour members is really one of the scandals of the modern political environment. Labour members are, in my experience of meeting them, they tend to be genuine, committed people who have a sense of the injustices that exist in the society and who have got themselves up off their arse to fight them, who have joined a political party, who spend hours of their lives knocking on doors, who are trade unionists, who want to see the grounds in their workplaces change by changing the laws in a way that might help workers to organise and to fight back. They are people who are part of justice campaigns, environmentalists or feminists or anti-racists, who join the Labour Party because they want to see some bigger manifestation of the fight for social justice than just what they can do in their communities. These are people who spend huge amounts of their time knocking on doors, persuading people, keeping the party going, organising for what exists that is decent and good within the Labour Party. And yet we have had nothing but contempt for these people expressed over years in our mainstream press, in the press like places, The Guardian, New Statesman, which should be defending Labour members and that vision of a more progressive society, but which actually, because they are so committed to their idea of politics as a small number of elite corporate robots, they don't want the messiness that comes with genuine grassroots democracy and member engagement in the party, and so they participate in that defamation. And it's not about one member here or another, and there's no question that members can and do say things that are objectionable, and there have been some examples of members saying deeply anti-Semitic things, and where that has been the case, where people do things like deny the Holocaust and whatever. Of course there should be measures taken against them. There's no debate on that. The question is the general view of the Labour membership given to society at large, and whether or not there is a sustained misrepresentation of who the members are, what they're about, what they believe in, and why that has taken place. And the answer is yes, there has been. There's been a sustained misrepresentation of what Labour members are about, and I think it is a deliberate campaign to try to discourage people from being engaged in politics, to try and discourage widespread democratic involvement and participation, to tell people to go back to sitting on their arses. That basically, even if you feel there are deep injustices in society, you can't and you shouldn't get active to solve them. So that, I think, is what drives the contempt for Labour members. And I have to say, it's never more clear than in the Labour Party itself, amongst its MPs, amongst its bureaucrats, who have an incredible amount of contempt for the membership. And let me tell you, having met a lot of the MPs, I meet more impressive Labour Party members every day of the week in constituency parties than those people. I meet more impressive grassroots activists in the Labour Party all the time than our MPs in the Labour Party. The idea they have a right to look down their nose at members who work so hard for the party, who feel such a genuine sense of injustice, who get no remuneration, no money, no nothing for all of what they put in. The idea that those MPs have a right to look down their nose at those members sickens me, and it makes me feel like there's something fundamentally wrong with Labour's attitude to politics and what it's supposed to represent. If you care about politics and you think things are fundamentally wrong in this country and there needs to be big change, you should be very worried about the idea of a political system in which there are two interchangeable parties of government, both run by empty suits with pro-corporate policies funded by big donors. Because the prospect of you ever getting ideas that are going to challenge established power within that paradigm are next to nil. So if you care about wealth inequality, if you care about the continuity of flatlining and low wages, if you care about how terrible working conditions are, if you care about cuts to your local council, if you care about major corporations getting away with paying no taxation, if you care about deep social injustices across many different aspects of our society, then you should really hope that there's a space within our politics for strong anti-establishment views. And that is what they're trying to close off now. That's what they're trying to eliminate now. They're trying to narrow, once again, the spectrum of politics so that it's the small number of people who agree with each other on 90% of the fundamental questions and have narrow disagreements up on top of that. That's it. Whereas people who disagree fundamentally with how the economy is, with our foreign policy, with the democratic system in this country because they think it is hollowed out and doesn't serve the people, those opinions are all going to be cast back to the margins and deemed illegitimate again. And the only legitimate opinions are going to be the polished opinions of a small set of professionalised politicians in Westminster. If that's your view of politics and you think that latter option serves you well, then you should cheer on the purging of the left from the Labour Party, the attack on democracy in the party, the character assassination of Jeremy Corbyn. If, on the other hand, you believe that politics should have a space for people who fundamentally challenge power, the established order, wealth, well then you need to be very concerned about what's happening in the Labour Party today. Well, first I should say it did not surprise me one bit to discover that millionaire donors to political parties might have racist opinions. And the idea that, very wealthy people who want to exert their influence in politics might say something like Abrams did in favour of apartheid in South Africa shouldn't shock anyone who has an understanding of the history, when for such a long time it was exactly these people in this country who were fighting against the anti-apartheid movement and people who were trying to organise in defence of black South Africans. And this brings you to a deeper point, which is the reason why the last 5 years, the idea of, and it didn't always come off in the best way, but the reason why the idea of a mass membership party, which didn't have to turn around cap in hand to the corporate elite in order to be funded, but which could be funded off the back of trade union funding, which is, of course, the funding of organised workers and members' subs. The reason why a party of that nature was so important was because it broke you from dependence on the corporate elite. And you can only actually challenge the corporate elite and their policies when you are no longer dependent on their funding to keep going. That's the fundamental question, fundamental truth of politics across the developed world. You can see it really clearly from the United States to Britain and to anywhere in between, that you can't take people's money one day and turn around and kick them the next. That's not how politics work. These people didn't get extraordinarily rich by being idiots with these questions in terms of money. There's obviously and always a quid pro quo. We can remember going back to the cash for honours scandals and all the rest. This is like deeply embedded in the politics of this country. It is corrosive of our democratic fabric. And instead of going along with the best tool that we have to fight back against that, which is creating a political party that isn't reliant on big money donors, we are now going the opposite direction. We're driving tens of thousands, if not 100,000 members out of the party, losing all of their subs. We're taking a Labour Party that did have a very strong base of union support, and now almost all of the left-leaning unions at least are talking about reducing their funding, Unite and the CWU and all the rest of it. And instead of having that party, which has genuine independence from the corporate elite and therefore can challenge them and say, pay your goddamn taxes, pay your workers decent money, support the public services and the social fabric in this country instead of tearing it apart, instead of having a party that can stand up to them on those terms because it isn't reliant on their funding, Keir Starmer is going the opposite way. He wants a party reliant on the funding of major corporate donors. And if we go that direction, well then we'll never stand up to them. This idea that a party funded in that way can turn around and put in place radical policies while in government is a complete nonsense. It runs against all the logic of why people give to political parties in the first instance. And I don't think your average Joe Soap in the street would believe you if you told them, yeah, we're going to take a few grand from them today, but tomorrow we'll make them pay their taxes. Who believes that? It's a nonsense, and it really should be exposed by the media. Of course it isn't. Not least because many of the same media outlets which are commenting on this are either owned by very wealthy moguls in the media sphere who are quite happy with that way of doing politics, or, say for instance in the case of The Guardian, they aspire to nothing more for this society than a return of warmed over corporate liberalism. Nothing more than major corporations who make huge profits and pay their workers nothing, but put a Black Lives Matter sticker on, or claim some kind of social liberalism that makes the well-to-dos in this country feel less bad about the deep injustices that are out there. And so they're quite happy with that kind of a politics. I'm not, and I don't think the vast majority of people who consider themselves socialists should be. We should be fighting for a politics where there's actual space for workers' power, for their involvement, and that means politics that is broken and free from the influence of big corporations and wealthy individuals, millionaire property developers and whoever the hell else. Sometimes I feel like, you're through the looking glass on these questions, because we spent the last 5 years being told we're living in some kind of Stalinist regime in the Labour Party, where Jeremy Corbyn was cracking down on all dissent, and his nefarious elite within the party were in control of everything. Actually, what was happening was every single day of the week, elected representatives and MPs who were only MPs because of the work done by local members and because of the support of trade unions were going into the press and undermining everything the party stood for day after day after day and facing zero consequence for it. Zero. Whereas now we have Jeremy Corbyn suspended from the whip. I think the only person who was suspended from the whip under Corbyn was John Woodcock, and it was over a sexual harassment allegation. That's the only instance over all of those years where action was taken against these MPs, who were allowed to run basically a rebel campaign within the Parliamentary Labour Party, and were given the freedom entirely to do so. And now we have a situation where that kind of dissent is obviously and directly not accepted by the party leadership and its bureaucracy. And it does bring home again the kind of hypocrisy of the liberal media, who were outraged over every minor incursion that Jeremy Corbyn as leader might have made against Labour MPs who disagreed with his policies, but have nothing to say of any substance about Corbyn not only being censored by the Labour Party, but actually having his whip removed after decades long preceding his time as leader, where he was a Labour MP in Islington. He now is not a Labour MP in Islington by the party's PLP at least standard anymore. So it's so incredibly how far they've gone against him, and by removing his whip. It is an extreme action that's very rarely taken, and they have nothing to say about that, none whatsoever. I think it is worth, while I'm on this as well, emphasising, how far the double standards in terms of the left of the Labour Party and the right of the Labour Party extend. Because, of course, Corbyn's suspension of the whip is not really about the EHRC report. Corbyn's statement afterwards, while it might have disagreed with a few lines in a 100-odd page document, accepted all the recommendations. Contrast this with Tony Blair's response to the Chilcot report and the Chilcot inquiry, where he rejected wholesale all of the findings of that inquiry in its report and all of its recommendations, and did so publicly at a press conference. Jeremy Corbyn has never done that. It almost feels strange to me to compare the two things, because of course in Tony Blair's instance we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people at least being killed as a result of his actions. But if we want to compare those two scenarios, those show straightforwardly the double standards applied to the left of the party and to the right of the party. And it also tells you, I think, what's happening more broadly, which is that the EHRC report is being used as a battering ram to try to shut down political debate and democracy in the party, to try to narrow the spectrum of acceptable opinion, not over questions of anti-Semitism, but over questions of left and right politics pro-democracy versus pro-corporate politics, which are running between the different factions of the party to this day. And if the same action had been taken by a Corbyn-led Labour Party against prominent right-wing figures, we would never have heard the end of it. They would have been paraded around every TV studio. There would have been front page stories. The Observer on a Sunday would have been running front pages for weeks and weeks on end. There would have been cause célèbre over them. There would have been photographers in their houses, taking photographs of these MPs who had been so wronged by Jeremy Corbyn and how depressed that they had been made, and big puppy eyes in the front pages of the Observer. And we haven't seen any of that for Jeremy Corbyn, and it is because, once again, unfortunately, but something we have to accept, that the media has its interests. And in this instance, the centre-left media's interest is to create a political system where the difference is between one pro-corporate party who's socially liberal and one pro-corporate party who's socially conservative. And the differences that they might have will be quite narrow. They can be, amplified through society, but they, in real terms, will be very, very narrow. And what they can't allow for in the centre-left media is anyone who might come along and say, well, what about we challenge all of the systems that create this extraordinary inequality of wealth, which actually creates the wealth for wealthy liberals as much as it does for wealthy conservatives, which allows wealthy liberals to underpay the people who work for them, to treat their people who mind their kids and clean their houses and whatever like crap, just as much as it does for wealthy conservatives. They want the conversation to be reduced to between a very narrow social sphere at the elite of society, people who have a hell of a lot of money but might happen to have liberal views, versus those who have a hell of a lot of money who might happen to have conservative views. We wanted to change politics, and still do, to one where the conversation is about the vast majority of people who work for a living and get screwed versus the tiny minority of people who live off wealth and sit around and just accumulate by their property wealth, by owning businesses and whatever else, the 10% in this country who owns a majority of the entire country's wealth versus the 50-60% who owns next to no wealth, and if they were to lose their wages tomorrow, they would then be set into a position of destitution within weeks at a push. That's the dividing line that really matters in politics. That's the dividing line that if you fight on those terms, you have a chance of changing things. The idea of returning to some parlour club debate between, elite liberals and elite conservatives is, for the times that we live in, with the level of inequality in this society, completely insufficient. My view of popularly held opinions that are wrong is that we can't tackle those without looking at the process that creates the opinions that are in people's heads. And I think, when you talk about, for instance, racist attitudes that workers might have, is a good example of this, because there's been a lot of shallow commentary from the liberal elite in this country about things like Brexit, and framing all kinds of working class people as just monolithically racist. And I tell you, when you organise within trade unions and you get talking to people about ideas that they have over questions like this, what you see very quickly is the blame pattern in society, and who controls that matters an awful lot. Who gets the blame for the problems that we face? Because people are angry at the injustice. They're angry at the fact they can't get on in life. They're angry at the fact that their living standards are being squeezed year on year, that their councils are being cut, that their kids' schools are not good enough, that they can't live the lives that they feel they deserve to live. And if they feel it is possible to direct their anger upwards, if you've got a political system and a media environment that tells them the truth, which is that the real injustice is created by small numbers of people amassing huge amounts of wealth and then not allowing that wealth to be dissipated to the rest of society, that the real blame should be laid at the feet of major corporate interests, the wealthy, small proportions of people who own enormous wealth, that they're the ones choking off your opportunities, well, then I think people go along with that. And I think people have a sense immediately at a visceral level, actually, no, that's right. It's true. Because I see it in my workplace, because I see it in my community, and they don't have any great amount of time for the elite in society. So they can be won over to those views. When, on the other hand, you have a political system which doesn't talk about that, which is where we're heading back to now, where you're going to have a centre-left party that basically doesn't believe in challenging the rich at all, and a centre-right party which, like this, the right-wing media, centre-right, whether we can still call the Tories centre-right, but anyway, and we have a right-wing party like the right-wing media, which spends all of its time banging the drum saying, no, the reason for your difficulties in life are the immigrants, or the reason for your difficulties in life are these people who look differently to you or sound differently to you down the road, or it's these young people, which is increasingly a part of this narrative now, the irresponsible youth who are, causing all these problems in society with their protests, and that's what's, preventing you from getting on in life. When you set the conversation up that way, well, then the blame all flows downwards, and it all flows towards people who, are within range for you to give a kick to. It is harder to give a kick upwards, but people will do it if they're told the truth about the way the world is, and they're given a real option to fight back against people who have power and who have wealth. You find a hell of a lot of resistance, even when it's difficult, because people have a sense of their own dignity. They don't like the idea that small numbers of extremely wealthy people can run their society and treat them like shit, and they just have to accept it. And they're quite prepared even to put a lot on the line to fight back against those people. But the vast majority don't ever hear those arguments. They don't ever have it put to them that way, and they're certainly never given a vehicle that they could use to fight back. And so what they get instead is the Sun and the Daily Mail and a diet of racism and xenophobia and all of those kind of solutions to society's problems. And it then is no surprise that people who are quite angry anyway adopt those views. The left has to accept that we have had a big defeat, an historic defeat over the recent years, not only in Britain, but with Bernie Sanders in America, with Syriza in Greece, which was in government, of course, and got crushed, with Podemos in Spain, which is now a much smaller kind of insurgency against the establishment than it once was. There was a time in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis where we were the ones with the energy and anti-system energy, and we looked like we were the real threat to the establishment, and I think that went away. And one of the things that happened was a populist right-wing movement came forward and managed to win power in a lot of different countries and gain a kind of strength in society. And it did it by being willing to continue putting forward its ideas regardless of what the establishment said about it. And this is a difficult thing maybe for us to get our heads around and to grapple with the reality of. Of course, I completely disagree with the populist right-wing narratives, no question about that, but they were more willing to stand by and fight through their kind of anti-establishment perspectives to such a degree as they existed than the left was. And they were also more willing to recognize the nature of this moment of politics, which is that after particularly 2015, people were so frustrated with the old way of doing things. The corporate political elites who believed in nothing, the politics of insincerity, these empty suits who, you could look at on TV and you just swap one in for another and for another and for another, and none of them would say anything of any interest. And people wanted a politics of conviction. And that, in the early stages of this left-wing breakthrough of previous years, that was what powered us. The idea that we said what we believed in, that we put forward our vision of society, even when it was not, easy to do so, and even when we were attacked by the establishment for doing it. And like the fundamental coalition that the left has to put together to win in society is not the coalition of the people with the nice views. Because at the end of the day, they don't necessarily fight for those views when it comes down to it. And how many times have we seen this? You know, people who express nice views about society, but then get in and they do like what the Democrats do in the United States, and they support corporate oligarchy and they support war, and they, you know, people forget the Black Lives Matter movement was born under Obama and his presidency. It wasn't born under Trump. So it's not actually the people with the nice views. The starting block for us on the left is the people who feel in their gut that there's an injustice in society, that they can't get on, that there's a systemic or a structural reason for that. And what it is the system is set up against them. And they have a visceral sense of politics, which is that it is wrong. And the way it works is wrong. It's wrong morally for the society, and it's wrong for them because it's screwing them over. And we have to respond to that. And we have to respond to that by channeling people's anger. You know, the liberal establishment looks at the anger that it sees in society that expresses itself through things like the Brexit vote, but through a number of different things. And it sees irrationality. It sees in the masses of people and the anger they have about how this, you know, god-awful society is being run. It sees in that irrationality that they just don't understand the way in which this all works. And maybe if we could just educate them, which means condescend to them and talk down to them, you know, that they'll eventually come over. We have to respond to that anger differently on the left. We have to say, no, you're right. You're right to be angry about things, and channel that anger in the right direction towards the people who are really responsible. The ruling elite who control our politics, control our economy, and they do it through their wealth. They do it by the fact that a tiny number of wealthy individuals and corporations own the vast majority of the wealth in this country, and that everyone else, in order to get by, has to rent themselves to them for a wage to live. And we have to express the reality of how frustrating it is to live in a system like that, in a country like that, an economy and a politics like that, and tell people you're right to be pissed about that. It's a long road back now, but if we can start from that point, which is trying to channel the issues that matter to the majority of people, as opposed to getting too tied into questions for just who the left is, to aim ourselves at the working majority, well then we will find that we have a constituency, and that this system is so broken now that they can't just put the cap back on this. They can't just restore a normal middle-of-the-road centrist politics. But we have to then, when we're in these fights, like in the Labour Party today, we have to be clear to people why they matter. Not for us, but for society, that they matter for the democratic nature of our society and what politics is about. And if it's going to be just captured by corporations, or if there's going to be a space for ordinary people. That they matter in terms of, is a party willing to stand up against the corporate elite and the wealthy? Or is it not? That they matter in terms of, are you going to be allowed to say things that are uncomfortable and hold debates and have, you know, democratic settings that are uncomfortable to people in power? Or is our whole political conversation in this country going to be reduced to a narrow, professionalised set in Westminster? These are questions that actually do matter. They matter to ordinary people, and they run through the debate that's happening in the Labour Party today. And unless we're able to communicate those broader questions, the why it matters to people, we won't move forward. But the degree to which we can communicate that, I think we're better set up. Because I think, honestly, in their gut, your average person who has to spend their life working in this society and seeing things getting worse year on year is going to feel closer to where we are in our gut than the empty suits at the top of the Labour Party.